They thought she was just a pretty face in a designer dress, a silent shadow behind a former president. But today, they would all learn how wrong they were. The courtroom was tense, buzzing with whispers and flashing cameras. At the center stood Melania Trump, cool and composed, as a federal judge delivered what many believed would be the final blow, a harsh fine, buried under legal jargon and media spectacle. A statement, they called it, a message to the elite, to her. But this wasn't a story about power falling. No, this was the moment power shifted. Because what the judge didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that Melania wasn't just defending herself. She was dismantling a system that thought it could shame her into silence. And she wasn't doing it with a team of high-powered attorneys or political favors. She was doing it with something far more dangerous, her own mind. The headlines were ready. The judgment was made. They thought the story was over. But then she spoke. And when she did, everything changed. The people who had mocked her, underestimated her, dismissed her as nothing more than a former First Lady caught in controversy. They were about to witness something unforgettable, a legal brilliance so precise, so devastating, that even the judge sat back, stunned. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. She had studied every word of the case, every loophole they thought she'd never notice. And now she was, flipping the script in real time, turning a public humiliation into a masterclass in control. So ask yourself this: what happens when the woman they tried to shame becomes the one holding the mirror? Justice doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it walks in wearing heels, speaks softly, and leaves a courtroom speechless. You're about to witness the truth behind the headlines, the scandal, the strategy, and the shocking moment that made even a federal judge question his own ruling. And the best part? This isn't just Melania's story. It's a story about underestimation, public perception, and a woman who refused to be defined by either. The fall? That was never hers. The twist? You won't see it coming. It wasn't just a courtroom. It was a stage set for public spectacle, a place where Melania Trump, often viewed as little more than a symbol, was about to face what many considered the inevitable. The court had been ready, the judge had made his ruling, and the media had, their headlines locked in. But this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the latest in a long series of events that seemed to follow her, like a shadow too dark to escape. For years, she had been scrutinized, reduced to a pawn in a much larger game: her marriage, her status as a former First Lady. Her every word and action was picked apart under the harsh glare of public opinion, but none of it was as personal as this. None of it hit her at the core like this fine. This was more than just a punishment. It was a statement, one aimed at reducing her to a mere symbol of the elite, someone who could be pushed around without consequence. To many, Melania had become synonymous with privilege. To others, she was simply the silent wife of a controversial president, a woman whose voice was rarely heard, whose actions were often overshadowed by the men around her. People often viewed her as cold, aloof, and calculated. She was always in the background, always playing the role of the dutiful partner, never making waves. But that's exactly what the world wanted to see. A woman who complied, who fit the mold they had created for her. Yet this fine was different. It wasn't just about her status. It was about something far more insidious. A system that believed the rich and powerful could do as they pleased, with no consequences. They saw her as another rich figure who could be knocked down a peg, a symbol of all that was wrong with the system, a system that had allowed the elite to rise to the top while the working class struggled beneath them. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about an entire class being targeted, ridiculed, and ostracized. And so, the judge delivered his ruling, swiftly, decisively. A fine. A slap on the wrist, they thought. It was as if he believed his gavel could silence her once and for all, that his decision would be the final word on the matter. He had no idea what he was walking into, This fine was more than a penalty. It was the manifestation of a much larger issue, the belief that those in power were above reproach. The judge, like so many before him, assumed that Melania Trump was nothing more than a product of wealth and status, someone who wouldn't dare challenge the very system that had allowed her to climb so high. To him, this was just another case to wrap up. But to Melania, this was a test of everything she had ever faced, of the assumptions, the judgments, and the scrutiny that had followed her for years. It was a system built on the idea that those with power, whether it was wealth, status, or influence, could never truly be held accountable. And if someone like Melania, a woman who had lived much of her life under the media's microscope, was to be punished, it would be seen as a victory for the common man. But here's where it gets interesting, because it was precisely this idea, this assumption of weakness and compliance, that made the injustice sting. The world had no idea that Melania wasn't just a passive bystander in her own life. She wasn't the victim in the story. No, she had been playing a very different game, and the world had simply failed to see it. There's something inherently human in the way we judge others, especially when we think we understand them. We look at someone like Melania Trump, and we think we know her. We assume her life is easy, that she's just another part of the elite machinery, immune to the struggles that the rest of us face, that she doesn't care. But this story isn't just about her. It's about how quickly we can all become blind to the deeper complexities of someone's existence. It's about how we judge people based on their surface, dismissing them as symbols of their wealth, their fame, or their status. And that's what the judge did. He assumed that this was just another case, another day in the life of a person, too far removed from reality to care about what was happening to them. But Melania had something else in mind. She didn't fit the mold they had made for her, and that was exactly why the injustice mattered. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about how the system had been rigged to favor the powerful, to assume that someone like her had no voice in the fight. It was about how society could so easily forget that beneath the polished exterior, beneath the headlines and the scandals, there was a woman who had spent years living under the weight of public judgment, constantly underestimated, constantly ignored. The fine was more than a mere slap on the wrist. It was a symbol of everything wrong with a system that saw her as nothing more than a trophy, a figurehead to be scrutinized, laughed at, and ultimately controlled. And in that moment, the injustice didn't just sting. It was a reminder of how quickly society could turn on its own, how quickly we could all become pawns in a game we never asked to play. But in that courtroom, as the judgment was handed down, one thing became clear. Melania Trump was no one's pawn, and she wasn't going to let anyone write her story for her. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. The courtroom, once filled with the chatter of whispers and sharp legal jargon, fell silent. The judge's gavel had struck with finality, and yet in that stillness, there was something else, something heavier. Melania Trump stood still, her back straight, her expression unreadable. As the weight of the fine settled over her like an invisible shroud, the world had waited for this moment. They had expected her to shrink, to falter under the pressure of a system that was designed to crush her. But instead, she did something no one anticipated. She looked down, not in defeat, not in shame, but with a quiet resolve. It was in that moment that Melania realized something crucial. The game they had been playing wasn't one she needed to lose. As she sat there in the sterile courtroom, surrounded by the noise of reporters and cameras, the world kept pressing their expectations on her. They wanted her to be the quiet, compliant figure who folded under pressure, who let the headlines write her story. They wanted her to disappear into the background, to be forgotten, just another casualty of a high-profile legal battle. But Melania wasn't interested in playing by those rules anymore. She thought about her journey, her life under the constant spotlight, her name always linked to the Trump brand, her image shaped by the media. For so long, she had been defined by others. But in this moment, this pivotal moment, she saw a different path. What if she could change the narrative? What if she didn't have to simply react to what was being done to her? What if the power wasn't in them at all? It was in her. The fine, the humiliation, the system. It all suddenly felt so distant. For the first time, she didn't feel like the pawn in this game. She didn't feel like she was playing by anyone else's rules. This was her chance to reclaim her own story. As she stepped out of the courtroom, a flood of thoughts raced through her mind. The weight of the decision she had just made wasn't lost on her. The world had already decided how this chapter would unfold. Melania Trump, silenced by the law, her reputation irreparably damaged. But in that moment, she made a choice. The fine wasn't a symbol of defeat. It was the catalyst for a new strategy. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number she had been avoiding for days. Her legal team had already prepared for the aftermath. But this was something different. This wasn't just about overturning the fine. It was about showing the world that they had underestimated her. Showing them that the quiet, composed woman they had grown so accustomed to wasn't as helpless as they thought. "I need you to prepare for something big," she said, her voice steady, the weight of her decision clear in her tone. "We're not just going to fight this fine. We're going to turn it into our advantage." She paused, allowing the magnitude of her words to sink in. This wasn't going to be easy. The legal battle ahead would be long, messy, and full of public scrutiny. But what did it matter? Melania had already learned that sometimes the best way to fight back wasn't to retreat into silence, but to take control of the narrative, to make her own moves, to turn the very thing meant to crush her into the force that would change everything. And with that decision, a new energy began to fill the room. It was as if the air around her had shifted, less heavy, less oppressive. The world might have thought it had her cornered, but in truth, Melania had just started playing her own game. What the world didn't know was that she had been preparing for this moment long before the fine had ever been imposed. Every legal battle, every public appearance, every scandal, it had all been building towards something bigger. Melania wasn't just a figurehead. She wasn't just a symbol of the past. She had been watching, listening, and learning the rules of the game, and now she was ready to rewrite them. As her team sprang into action, working on a strategy that would shock the public, Melania's mind sharpened. This wasn't just about fighting back. It was about making sure the world knew her power. She would stand firm, she would speak when it mattered, and she would make sure her actions spoke louder than any headline could. She knew that the road ahead would be tough. The press would twist every move she made. The legal system would try to break her. But in that moment of realization, she understood something crucial. The more they pushed, the more they underestimated her, the stronger she would become. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for anyone who had ever been underestimated, silenced, or cast aside. It was about showing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, even when society expects you to fail, there's always a way to flip the script. And so, as the days stretched into weeks, Melania began to prepare for her retaliation. The fine was just the beginning. The real battle was only starting, and the judge, the media, and the world had no idea what was coming next. The courtroom buzzed with the usual energy, a mix of tension, excitement, and media frenzy. But this time, something was different. The atmosphere had shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the very air around the case had thickened. The judge, who had once stood with authority, had begun to look uneasy. His initial confidence, built on the assumption that he had successfully struck the final blow, was starting to crack. Melania Trump, once thought to be simply a silent figure, was no longer the woman they believed her to be. The press had painted her as little more than a trophy wife, someone who wore her designer outfits and smiled for the cameras, but never dared to step out of line. But in the weeks that followed her fine, it became increasingly clear that they had severely underestimated her. The legal battle, which had started with a sense of inevitability, now seemed to be slipping from the judge's grasp. The fine once considered a simple penalty, had turned into the spark that ignited a firestorm. Melania's legal team, now working overtime, began to uncover something that would change the course of the case. A flaw, a crack in the system they had relied upon to keep her quiet. And Melania? She wasn't just reacting to the blows thrown her way. She was preparing her own counterattack. One afternoon, as the legal team sifted through documents, one of the lawyers came across an email. It was a routine document, something that appeared to be insignificant at first. But as they dug deeper, they realized that the communication within the email chain was far from routine. It pointed to something bigger, something the judge had not anticipated. A past ruling, a decision that had been made under questionable circumstances. And more importantly, it suggested that the judge might not be as impartial as he had led everyone to believe. This was the moment. The moment when Melania's quiet brilliance began to come to the forefront. What the judge had failed to account for was that Melania had always been aware of the legal nuances surrounding her case. She had quietly studied every precedent, every judgment, every angle. While the public saw her as a figurehead, she had spent years understanding the power structures that governed the very world that sought to control her. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't even strategy in the traditional sense. It was something more. Melania had learned how to read the room, how to anticipate moves before they were made. She had listened, observed, and waited. The revelation about the judge's prior involvement in questionable rulings was the tipping point. Her legal team quickly moved to file a formal motion for recusal, citing the conflict of interest and bias that now appeared undeniable. It was a move that shifted the balance of power in the case, one that the judge had never seen coming. But it wasn't just the legal document that made this moment so crucial. It was Melania herself. She had sat through the entire process watching, as the system, which had assumed she would crumble, continued to grind forward. Now, with a single precise move, she had exposed the cracks in the facade. The media, which had been quick to label her as weak, now found themselves scrambling to cover the story they hadn't anticipated. For Melania, the fine had never been about money. It had been a catalyst, a tool. And now, it was clear. Her decision to fight back was not just a response to injustice, it was a declaration. She was no longer just a name to be dragged through the mud. She was a force to be reckoned with. As the judge's face turned pale, his confidence shattered, Melania watched with a quiet satisfaction. Her move had been deliberate, calculated. The moment had arrived when the world would finally see that she wasn't the helpless figure they had imagined. She wasn't just playing the game, they were. The reversal wasn't just about legal maneuvering. It was about the moment when Melania Trump stood before the judge and saw something in his eyes that no one had expected. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear that his control, once unchallenged, was slipping away. The emotional stakes had escalated. What had once seemed like a simple legal case, an issue of fines and penalties, had turned into a fight for respect, for agency. For Melania, this was more than a courtroom battle. It was a battle for her voice, for her right to define her own narrative. And as the judge's grip loosened, it became painfully clear. The very system that had tried to suppress her, the system that had assumed her silence was a form of compliance, was now on the verge of crumbling. Her legal brilliance wasn't just in her strategy, it was in her ability to understand the rules of power, to turn them against those who had tried to control her. And in that moment, the court, the public, and the judge were all forced to confront one undeniable truth. Melania Trump was not just surviving, she was winning. The courtroom had descended into chaos. The media, once so eager to declare Melania Trump's downfall, were now scrambling to cover the reversal they had never seen coming. The judge, who had thought himself untouchable, sat there in stunned silence as the weight of his own decisions began to bear down on him. Melania's legal team had done what many thought impossible. The motion for recusal had been granted, and the case against her was now on the brink of unraveling. But the true victory wasn't in the legal maneuvering. It was in the way that the very system, which had long kept the powerful in control, was now showing cracks that Melania had meticulously exposed. And the judge, once a figure of authority, now found himself caught in a whirlwind of his own making. His previous rulings, once viewed as authoritative, now came under scrutiny. The media, which had pounced on every flaw, every misstep of Melania's life, now turned their focus onto him. The public, once so eager to bring her down, began to question everything they thought they knew. The scales of justice had tipped, and they tipped in Melania's favor. But there was something more profound happening in that courtroom, something far beyond the legal drama. As the judge's authority crumbled, so too did the illusion that those with power could operate above the law, immune to the very system they controlled. Melania had turned the tide. The fine that was meant to crush her had instead become the catalyst for her triumph. As the news spread, the story quickly shifted. Headlines that once mocked her now praised her legal brilliance. She had used the system against itself, not with brute force or manipulation, but with quiet intelligence. Her victory wasn't about defeating the judge. It was about proving something much bigger. That no one, not even those in the highest positions of power, could escape accountability forever. But Melania, ever composed, didn't bask in the spotlight. There was no grandstanding, no moment of public celebration. She didn't need it. The justice that had been served was enough. The victory wasn't just about winning the case. It was about reclaiming control over her own narrative. For years, the world had written her story, defined her by their own standards, and decided her worth. Now, she had taken back that pen, and she had written her own ending. The media, once quick to label her as nothing more than a trophy wife or a silent bystander, were now faced with the uncomfortable truth. Melania Trump was a force in her own right, one whose intellect and resilience had been underestimated for far too long. And as they tried to shift their coverage, as they scrambled to make sense of what had just happened, they couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She had not only proven her worth, but had shown the world that she was a woman who could never be defined by anyone but herself. But the real justice came in the form of the judge's downfall. His career, once built on the confidence that his power was unshakable, began to disintegrate. The legal community, once solidly behind him, now questioned his ethics, his impartiality, and his very judgment. His past decisions came under renewed scrutiny, and his reputation, built on years of assumed authority, began to crumble. Karma had struck, but not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't a dramatic, public confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It was a quiet, calculated unraveling of the very system that had tried to suppress Melania. And in the end, the justice wasn't in the fine or the courtroom ruling. It was in the way Melania had taken control of her own destiny. She didn't need to seek revenge. The world had already given her everything she needed: a platform, an opportunity, and a chance to prove that the true power didn't lie with those who held the gavel. It lay with those who understood how to navigate the game, how to turn the tables when everyone least expected it. For Melania, this was about more than legal victories or media coverage. It was about reclaiming her own voice, her own strength. She had been underestimated, belittled, and dismissed for so long. But now, as the media shifted its focus from mocking her to respecting her, and as the judge's reputation dissolved, before the public's eyes, it became clear that the true victory had been hers all along. And so, as the dust settled and the story began to fade from the headlines, Melania Trump walked away with something far greater than a legal victory. She walked away with dignity, respect, and a lesson that would echo far beyond the courtroom. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because in the end, the most powerful weapon is the one that's been hidden in plain sight all along. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through the quiet, deliberate unraveling of the system that had tried to silence her. In the end, the world learned that no one, no matter how high they rise, is above the truth.